Hello, my name is Chris Gleason. I'm a middle school science teacher at Greenhills School in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I also teach Computer 7, and I'm the middle school FTC robotics coach.
And I'm Jim Gleason. I am Chris's husband, and I am a retired electrical engineer.
We are developing this video based on the presentation that we made at the National Science Teacher Convention in Nashville this past April on the Renewable Energy Dashboard for Student Education. Energy is a major theme in science curriculum. Students need to understand how energy flows through systems. It's also important for students to understand how the various alternative energy resources promote sustainability at every level. At Greenhills School, we are very fortunate that we have a renewable energy dashboard that can collect, display, and archive the data from the renewable energy resources we have on our rooftop. This provides students with opportunities to engage in STEAM activities, emphasizing data analysis and the engineering aspects of a STEAM education. Our presentation will be divided into 3 parts. In part 1, we'll talk about the existing renewable energy dashboard at Greenhills. In part 2, we'll talk about how to scaffold curriculum using the resources that RENDI provides for middle school and high school education. And in part 3, we will revisit later on initiating feedback from you on the following topics. Is RENDI useful for middle school and high school education? The interest that you would have in making the Greenhills RENDI data available to your school, the interest in replicating a similar energy resource and data collection system at your school, and then to consider if the RENDI capabilities complement other educational resources related to energy, weather, data analysis, and STEAM. And finally, how do we support teachers to devote the time and energy to develop and incorporate related lessons in their classroom activities in place of some of the current lessons in the math and science curriculum?
This slide and the several that follow will provide additional details on the energy dashboard. This is the components inside the school building that the students can walk by and routinely see. In the display cabinet here, we have the various components that collect the data and pass it to the computer, and we'll talk about these in more detail in a slide that follows. Immediately above the cabinet, we have some posters that provide an overview of the overall system. Students can walk by and see this information if they haven't seen it already, or refresh their memories in case they have forgotten. We have a 50-inch display monitor here that shows data in real time. We have LED lights that are controlled automatically by software that runs on the computer that light the dedication wall for this particular portion of the building. This slide shows the renewable energy resources that are being monitored by the energy dashboard. We have a vertical wind turbine. It's about 4 feet tall. It sits on top of a fiberglass pole that's about 15 feet tall. The entire system is mounted on the second floor roof. The wind turbine produces 3-phase AC power that runs down into the school building, where it is monitored by the voltage and current sensors in the display cabinet. The position of the wind turbine is far from ideal in terms of generating power from it, but it is more than adequate for the educational purposes for which it is being used here. We also have a 5-watt solar array. It produces DC power that runs down into the cabinet. Similarly, there we monitor the voltage and current being produced by it. And having the solar array gives us a nice capability to compare the performance of the wind turbine versus the solar array. The school also has a green roof that covers portions of it. You can see it here. Most of the school is covered by a white roof, and we have some temperature sensors that monitor the temperature of the white roof, the green roof, and we also have our weather station. It's very hard to see, but it's located right up here that provides air temperature and many other environmental factors. This slide provides some additional information on the sensors and the various componentry that makes the energy dashboard work. Up here, we're showing a picture of one of the temperature sensors that is immediately adjacent to the white roof. This is a picture of the green roof. It was taken at a time when the green roof wasn't green. And it's virtually impossible to see, but there is, in fact, another identical temperature sensor that is tucked underneath the green roof so that we can compare the impacts of the green roof on the temperatures. We have a Davis weather station on the roof. It has a solar radiance sensor. It's not actually shown in this photograph. This device communicates with the material or with the componentry inside over an RF link. On the internal cabinetry inside the school, we have the computer, we have a 12-volt battery. The weather station has its own display, its own console. It has a data logger that provides digital data into the computer. We have a number of sensors. We actually have some temperature sensor interfaces that sit in the cabinet, along with 3 different voltage sensors and 4 current sensors. We obtain the sensors and much of the interface componentry here from Vernier. We've been very pleased with the support that we've received from them, and their equipment has performed flawlessly for the better part of 3 years now. Basically, the wind turbine power comes into the charge controller here as 3-phase AC. The charge controller rectifies it before it passes it over to the battery. The solar array produces DC power directly. It goes through its own charge controller on the way to the battery. We have a device here that is another Vernier product that provides power to the LED or to the relays. The relays control the on-off state of the LEDs that shine on the wall. We also have a relay that controls an auxiliary charger, although we really haven't had to use that since we added the solar array sensor to the system. This slide shows the architecture of the Greenhills Renewable Energy dashboard components. The green boxes show the components that are fundamental to the collection of energy from a wind turbine and the solar array. That power goes through the respective charge controllers of the 2 devices. They charge then the 12-volt battery. We have the LED lights that we can turn on and off via the relay here, and that process is controlled by the software that we'll talk about later. We also have the auxiliary charger that can also be turned on and off, although, as I said before, we haven't really had to use that recently. The yellow components are the ones that are associated with monitoring the system. And it is very important that students, particularly as they get into a detailed examination of the data that will be made available to them, understand the complete process here. There are certainly the environmental factors that influence the performance of the wind turbine and the solar array, but the ultimate data that's being produced is also a function of the many different interactions of the components that are involved in the measurement process. The energy dashboard is controlled by custom software written in LabVIEW. LabVIEW is a graphical data flow programming environment. It's used very widely in industry and also by many universities. LabVIEW was developed by a company called National Instruments, and they make licenses for a product they call LabVIEW for Education, and they sell those at very affordable prices to middle schools and high schools. And we'll talk about the actual price of the LabVIEW software later. Developing custom software to control the energy dashboard has taken quite a bit of effort, but it was very important to do it that way because it gave us complete control of how we were recording data, how we are archiving it, and also very importantly of how it is being displayed. We purchased our LabVIEW for Education license through Vernier, and that worked out very well because Vernier with the LabVIEW software provided drivers that allowed us to interface very conveniently to their various sensors and data interface equipment. We've also received excellent support from Vernier in terms of some fairly detailed questions about how to use the LabVIEW software. This portion of the slide is impossible to see in detail, but this basically is the overall software that is written in what is called the block diagram. This red box, it provides an enlargement of this little one here, and it shows in more detail how data flow programming works and graphical programming. You have these various little icons that are available from a very extensive menu of different functions. You basically drop those down onto the block diagram. You then connect them to preceding components by these virtual wires, and these individual components then can complete their particular function when all of their inputs are available, and their output then passes to the next function. And so that's the data flow programming nature of this. This slide shows a screenshot of the custom display that we developed for the energy dashboard. It shows it is shown on the 50-inch TV monitor immediately above the dashboard cabinet. This video shows the dynamics of the display. This was recorded on a day when the wind was very strong. As you can see, it's up around 30 miles per hour. Over here, we're showing real-time results. We're showing the wind speed, the solar radiance. We're seeing in here the red signal is the voltage, one of the three phases of the voltage from the wind turbine. It's the AC voltage. The white line shows the battery voltage. It turns out when the voltage from the wind turbine exceeds the battery voltage, it starts to generate current to the charge coming out of the charge controller. That's what's being shown here. Down here we have other real-time updates of the battery voltage, the wind turbine, and the solar array currents we're showing here. We're also showing real-time updates of the power from each. We have down here real-time updates of the temperatures from the air temperature and from the two rooftop sensors. Down over here we have some archival data. This shows a one-day history, a one-week history. This is updated every hour. This is a one-year history. We're showing across here the power outputs from the wind turbine and the solar array. Across here we show the wind speed in miles per hour. This is the solar radiance values, and this is the temperature of the air, and also the green roof and the white roof. This is a monitor that actually is used in controlling when the LEDs go on and off. It might be a little bit hard to see here, and this is a further update of the weather data. The energy dashboard records its archive files in spreadsheet format. They're text files, which means that it's easy to import them into any standard data analysis package, Fathom, Excel, MATLAB, and really any other one that might be of interest. The spreadsheet files contain a header record that identifies each column. We have documentation on what each column means. The header records are followed by data records. Each data record has a timestamp. This is just an example of a plot of wind turbine power and solar array power over time.
So now let's start part 2 of our presentation. What does it look like if you're scaffolding what an energy dashboard is, and what might lessons look like in a school that houses the 6th through 12th grade? I will focus on the middle school curriculum, and Jim will focus on the high school. The key in middle school is to set students up so that at the high school level, they can develop mathematical models to predict the output of a wind turbine and solar array as a function of the key factors that control the power output of those devices. In the 6th grade, you want students to learn about factors that you could see and feel. Let's consider the following driving questions. What is RENDI? How does it work? And why is it important to me? What are weather and electrical sensors? And what do they produce? And why are they useful? Students can learn about concepts related to light energy or weather through a curriculum. They can manipulate solar cells or maybe a light source and measure an output. They realize something is produced when light hits the surface of a solar array. At Greenhills, the next step might be to take students to the rooftop and view the alternative energy resources that we have. That gets them excited and sets the stage for a variety of opportunities that they will have in coming years to explore the resources that the Energy Dashboard provides. You can take them down and they can look at the monitor and see all the parameters that are being displayed from the weather station and also from our alternative energy resources. Next, they can look at the display case and see how the very same sensors that they may use in their classroom to measure current and voltage are the ones that are measuring the output of the alternative energy resources on the rooftop. They also get a chance to see how all the components are connected. Back in the classroom, students can decide what variables to plot in order to allow them to look at the solar radiance variations throughout a month. Students can see that on a monthly basis, the solar radiance peaks at a variety of levels from day to day. What accounts for those differences? They may also see that the peaks begin at 0 at the beginning of the next day and realize that when there is no solar radiance, there is nothing that is produced. Students might also take a look and see what are the trends throughout the course of a year. This next graph shows solar radiance daily maximum output and takes us from February into the spring, over the summer, through the fall, into the winter, and back up into the spring again. Students see the general trend that as the months go into the summer, solar radiance increases. However, when they look at even on the daily basis throughout the course of a year, we have a variety of peaks that rise and fall throughout the course of the month. Yet the general trend holds true, that in the summer we will have more solar radiance than in the winter months. Building on the 6th grade experience, 7th graders should think more about how the energy data is generated that they will be analyzing. Let's consider the following driving questions. What is the relationship between current, voltage, power, and energy? What are the key environmental factors that affect the power generation by a solar array and a wind turbine? And given the Greenhills solar array produces more energy than does the wind turbine, why does DTE Energy invest heavily in wind energy in Michigan? Throughout the course of the curriculum, students can collect current and voltage on their tabletop wind turbines and solar arrays and compute the power and the energy. Students can then determine what they should plot in order to see what the difference is in the energy generation throughout the course of a month between the solar array and the wind turbine. Students can see that the solar radiance that affects the solar array energy production seems to follow the similar rises and falls throughout the course of the month than the energy production for the solar array, likewise for the wind speed for the wind turbine. If students consider the energy generation throughout the course of a month between a solar array and a wind turbine, they can clearly see that more consistently throughout the course of the month, the solar array produces more energy than does the wind turbine. They see that on some cases, though, the wind turbine does outperform the solar array. So now, what conclusions can students make relating to their own life? If they were looking to consider which alternative energy resources to use in their homes, they may clearly see that the solar array may be the way to go. However, what they need to understand is that systems are complicated and that the conditions under which we have our solar array and wind turbine are not optimal. So that when the DTE Energy looks at producing energy for the masses, they need to consider the conditions that they can put the solar array and wind turbine under in order to maximize energy generation. So wind turbines farms are placed along the shorelines of Michigan and they produce a lot of power. We're in the middle of the city where Ann Arbor is. students may clearly see that the better choice may be solar arrays in order to help them reduce their carbon footprint for energy use. So if sixth grade is phenomenon that you could see and feel, and seventh grade is how to measure those things, then what's the next step for eighth graders? Students know more about how the energy dashboard operates, how the data is organized, and they have more software tools and mathematical tools that they can use and apply to the data that they'll be analyzing. Eighth grade is the beginning of mathematical modeling, which then progresses into high school. So let's consider the following driving questions. What is a mathematical model of a physical system and why is it useful? Can you develop a first-order mathematical model for the energy dashboard solar array power and wind turbine power and provide a physical interpretation for your model? And can you identify data samples that don't fit your model well, and can you explain why those samples may have occurred? Students can extract similar relevant data for the solar array and wind turbine in order to identify the independent and dependent variables, place them on the appropriate axis in order to develop a graph that they will analyze for the power generation over a month. Students can analyze this monthly data and construct a first-order mathematical model of the main driving factor of the wind turbine and of the solar array power outputs. In math classes, students are given data and taught what a regression means and how to do it. And here, students can apply that knowledge to the data and develop a mathematical model and explain how it relates to the physics of GRED. Students see that in the solar array, the data seems to fit very nicely linear regression. Looking at the power turbine, at the wind turbine power data, they see that it looks like a quadratic at first blush, but hopefully students will remember throughout the course of the sixth grade and their seventh grade that there's a cut-in value where the wind speed needs to reach 5 to 6 miles an hour before there is any power that is generated by the wind turbine. If students are to look at that and consider the data points after 6 miles an hour, students see that it does seem to follow a linear regression. On top of that, students can look at this data that seem to be outlier data. And how do we explain that at almost 12 miles an hour at a wind speed that there's no power generation? Students should be directed to consider that systems are complicated and that the energy system is under the influence of a number of factors, not only environmental, but also hardware and software factors that collect that data. There's a very good reason for this data point here at almost 12 miles an hour. If students were to look more closely at how the architecture of the energy dashboard, they can be directed with either the teacher or on their own to try and determine that at this point the charge controller had decided that the batteries were full, and so as not to overcharge them, it flipped the switch and turned the power off.
I'm going to present a set of 10 slides, and I hope to go through them rather quickly, giving some initial thoughts on how to use the energy dashboard data at the high school level. As I said before, I am not an educator, I am a retired engineer, but we wanted to be able to provide some substance as to what could be done at the high school level besides just some vague sense of we'll do something more and do something more challenging. So beginning about a month before the Nashville conference, I put together a data set, and basically I went back to our 1 hour data from the energy dashboard over the past year. So this is running from February of 2015 until, well, really through February of 2016. That produced a data set of almost 8,200 samples. And here's a plot of the solar array power versus the solar radiance, and correspondingly the wind turbine power versus the wind speed. And if you recall in what Chris showed for the 8th grade, we showed similar plots, but only for a month. And so the question that comes to mind here is, looking at this data over this extended time period, why does this data look considerably different than what we saw for just a month? And this comes out most strongly for the solar array, where we see this linear tendency that a lot of the data lines up along a nice straight line here. But there's also a lot of samples that are off of this line, mostly above and to a lesser extent below. Correspondingly, for the wind turbine data, we see also a lot more samples that vary away from the more strong, sort of quadratic, but fundamentally probably more linear along this portion above the cutout speed. And so the question then is, well, what is really going on here, and could we develop a more sophisticated model to explain what is going on in this more complicated situation? It turns out after digging into this a little bit, I quickly discovered that in the wind turbine data, we really didn't have a whole lot of samples where we had substantial amounts of wind turbine power when we're looking over periods of an hour. That's quite a long time. The winds blow, at different speeds over the course of an hour. And so I'm really going to concentrate everything that I'm going to talk about further here on the solar array data. And in my very last slide, I will say something that addresses the issue of not having enough data samples, particularly in this hour-by-hour data. The first thing I did is take our solar array data and generate a three-dimensional histogram. I'm using MATLAB here just because I was somewhat familiar with it, but any other software that has similar capabilities could be used in place of MATLAB. This little video will show what happens as we rotate it around. There's nothing surprising here, but it's the kind of thing that I think could have some intrigue for students in terms of using these advanced visualization tools. MATLAB has a nice capability to look at individual samples and see how many samples fall in particular histogram bins. And these are just important elements in any data analysis exercise. And in particular, what we saw here is that we had a lot of samples at very low solar radiance and low power. This is totally as would be expected, since we're collecting data 24 hours a day and there's no solar radiance at night. But what this tells us is that the data is behaving as we would expect, and also that these samples here that really represent noise, basically there is no power, are in fact constrained to this very low end of our distribution. And it tells us then that we can actually excise these samples from the data set, cut down on the number of samples, and pay attention out here to where we're seeing some of the more interesting trends away, and be confident that we're not seeing noise out there, but that there are significant factors that are causing these variations out there. Eliminating our samples with very low solar array power reduced our data set to about 2,300 samples. And so the first question I asked myself was whether or not the on-off state of the LEDs has a significant effect on the distribution. On the left, we're looking at a scatter plot of the 2,300 samples, except here we have color-coded it according to the solar array power, running from a dark blue to a bright yellow. Over here, I generated a three-dimensional plot using a parameter that we calculate that tracks the on-off percent of the LEDs. So when the on-off percent is 0, it means the LEDs are off. When it's 100, it's on. It means they're on for a full hour. And then, of course, there are transition periods in between. And this video shows a distribution, and we will rotate it. And as you watch this, you can quickly see here's all the where it's off. Here's the lesser number of samples where it's on. Quite clearly, the distributions, though, between when it's fully on to when it's fully off are looking very similar, so we can quickly come to the conclusion that the LED on state, and the LEDs draw about 10 watts of power, so it's fairly significant relative to the power produced by the solar array and even the wind turbine, but clearly we can decide that it is not a significant factor here. So what about air temperature? The question is, does that have a significant effect on the solar array power? You would expect that it would have some effect, since it is well known that solar array efficiency decreases with increasing temperature. So here we're going to look at a 3D scatter plot in this little video in a moment, where the third dimension now is the air temperature data as recorded with the weather station. And as we rotate it around, you'll see that there are some indications of some structure in the data here, but there isn't a real strong sense of a structure that could be used as to suggest that temperature is a strong predictor of solar array power, in addition to solar radiance. And in the next set of slides, we'll show, or a few more slides down the road, we'll show where there's a factor that is a very strong indicator. So just keep that in mind. But basically, we've ruled out that the LEDs don't have a lot of power, don't have a lot of effect, and temperature maybe has some, but it's not a real strong indicator. So given that temperature wasn't having a real strong effect, I was beginning to get concerned that we might not be able to develop a real good model of the data for the solar array to predict the power. So a technique that's often useful in analyzing data is to focus attention on a smaller subset. So I went back to the set of 2,200 or whatever it was samples, covering all of the different solar radiances, and extracted a subset that just dealt with the solar radiances between 500 and 600 watts per square meter. That produced about 253 samples. And this is a plot then again of solar array power versus temperature. And we do see, as we would expect, that there is somewhat of a linear trend here, that the solar array power at the lower temperatures typically is higher than it is correspondingly at the higher temperatures. But again, there's a lot of other points that we know are not noise samples. So the question is, well, what's really causing all of this other data? So I decided next to plot this same data set that we had over here, but to look at it as a function of time. So here we are looking at the solar array power versus time running from February through basically February of 2016. And this is a very interesting result because it shows some definite structure in the data, much stronger structure than we saw over here. We see that the solar array power in February is typically higher than it is later in the year when we're looking within this restricted band of data. And the variation within over time, variation looking in this dimension is really not all that great. It was a little bit disconcerting at first that there was this gap in the data, but when you think about it a little more, this is in the fall into the winter, and basically we're just not getting solar radiances in the range of 500 to 600 watts per square meter. So now we're going to look at a 3D plot where we have solar radiance and time involved. And this is the result. And as we rotate the data, you'll see once we get it to the proper orientation, we begin to see some very definite structure in the data, much more so than we saw when we had solar radiance and temperature. If you also notice, as the data is rotating, it appears that in a limited time period that we have a linear relationship with the solar radiance. So that would say really that is a indicator of the solar array efficiency being a constant over a short time period, but varying significantly over the course of the year that we were looking at. So I parsed the data out on a month-by-month basis, and since it appeared that there was a linear trend within each month, I used the MATLAB curve fitting tools to do a linear regression, and this video will quickly go through the data on a month-by-month basis. And we see here that as we get into, this is March, April, this is May, June, July through the summer months, we're getting some very good fits. We're getting quite a bit of data. As we get later in the year, we get less data. We get not as strong a fit. But basically, the data does follow a linear trend over the course of these time frames. Unfortunately, the axes in these plots, as the video was playing, did not remain constant, so it's hard to see that. But I then took the basically the slopes, the P1 factor of the linear regressions, plotted that is shown here. We have the P1 factor versus time. This is MATLAB's way of indicating time. So this is February, March, April, all the way up to December. And I tried to fit various even third and fourth order polynomials, so that none of them worked out very well. But then MATLAB provided a spline interpolation that produced the solid blue line here that provides a very good fit to the data. So the spline function lets us make a prediction of the solar array power, which is plotted down here, as a function of the solar radiance and the time of year. So here we're comparing the measured solar array power versus the predicted power, the basis for our model, and we see that we're getting a fairly good fit. If it were a perfect fit, it would be a very strong, very narrow line right along 45 degrees here. It certainly isn't perfect, but there is quite a bit of the variation of the data that has been explained by the two factors of solar radiance and time of year, and added to that with the physical interpretation that it's a function of the solar array efficiency. Now, there's still a lot of, well, I won't say a lot, but there's considerable amount of variation, and so certainly there is more to be done here to dig into this data further and understand what's going on. Hopefully the slides that I've just presented will spur some ideas in the minds of the math and high school physics teachers about how to lead students through a more detailed analysis of the data from the energy dashboard. Clearly what I've shown is a start, but it is not complete. Some initial ideas I have for further analysis are shown here. One of the most obvious ones is that time per se should not be a factor that affects the solar array output power. The array is not significantly aging over 13 months. There has to be some other physical factors going on here. One of my strongest thoughts going in would be the fact that the solar radiance sensor in the weather station is measuring in the ground plane, and the solar array itself is pointing towards the south, and it's angled up towards the sun. So one of the things that would be very interesting to do would be to take the solar radiance measurements from the weather station and compute what is the solar array power, what is the solar power that is incident upon the solar array. That will require developing knowledge or a model of how the sun is moving through the sky as a function of the time of year and also the time of day, but I think that could be a very important factor, especially when combined with temperature changes for developing a better prediction. Another factor that occurs to me is that we should record data over shorter time periods. As I mentioned, we have been looking at data recorded over an hour-by-hour basis. In fact, we can record data more often, and at the moment I have started to record data on a minute-by-minute basis. The plots below show data recorded over one day in March of 2016 on a minute-by-minute basis. The red line is the measured power, the blue line is the predicted solar array power using a constant solar array efficiency. So basically it can be thought of as a scaled version of the solar radiance. Looking at the time plot on the left as well as the scatter plot on the right, we can see that there's a lot more structure in the data now because we have samples that occur over much smaller time frames. There is also still a fair amount of dispersion, but if time permitted, we could go into a more detailed discussion as to why that occurs. We believe that the investment that's already been put into the development of the energy dashboard at Greenhills can be leveraged to the benefit of other schools. And if, as you have been watching this video and you are thinking about that, you must be asking yourself some questions about the cost involved. This slide and the following one addresses that topic. Here under this bullet, I've totaled up the total development costs that has gone into the Greenhills system so far in terms of the cost for the hardware. I've also added a note here as to the amount of effort, of which there's been a considerable amount of effort that's gone into the software development. It's interesting to note that the major costs in terms of the hardware falls upon the wind turbine and the 15-foot fiberglass pole. Most of the other costs are quite reasonable, and on the following slide we will talk about how to reduce the costs even further. The wind turbine at Greenhills was purchased in 2007 using funds donated by the 2007 graduating class. That was almost 10 years ago, and since that time there's been a lot of more commercialization of wind turbines, smaller wind turbine systems, and just looking out on the internet you can find multiple items listed out there in the range of $500 that would appear to produce as much power as the Greenhills turbine does. And keeping in mind again that this is really for educational purposes, we really don't need to generate that much power. We really think that by going to a cheaper wind turbine, you could produce a very nice replication of the basic capability that we've shown previously here for closer to $4,200. And of course, there's other things you could do to cut costs even further. Another very important factor is that the development cost of the software has already been paid for. Undoubtedly, going to a slightly different system will require some amount of tweaking, but there is an awful lot of investment here to be leveraged to be able to go further with this basic capability in other schools.
We are at the end of our video presentation, and on this slide we just relisted the topics that we asked for you to keep in your mind as you went through our presentation. If you would like to give us feedback, we would very much appreciate hearing from you, and if you have any questions for clarification, our emails are listed on our title page. In addition, if you would like to join our teachers as we look at developing curriculum using any of the data from the Energy Dashboard, we'd appreciate hearing from you as well. We hope you have a wonderful day, and thanks again for spending some time with us.